Well, it's great to have Dr. Greg Wills with us. Dr. Gregory Wills, who is a research professor at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and also serves as the director of the B.H. Carroll Center for Baptist Heritage and Mission. And you've been in that role how long now?
For almost a year.
Almost a year. And it's been a very unusual year as you tried to get acclimated to the climate there in Texas.
You're right, but the most unusual thing is, of course, the COVID-19 experience, and we've all had that. But the biggest change, of course, is having been 25 years with my precious colleagues and friends at Southern Seminary and our church, LaGrange Baptist Church in Kentucky, just tearing out all those roots and removing. That's been the biggest adjustment.
You are deeply missed by me and many others in this area, and I know friends and workers that you've labored with a number of years, like you mentioned. So you were there for all of those years. Since what was the first year you came?
94.
94. Okay.
94. Yes.
Really early on in terms of Dr. Mohler's presidency.
Right.
And so you left us, you abandoned us.
Yeah.
Why did you leave us? And by us, I mean those who are affiliated with Southern Seminary. Tell us about that decision. I know that had to be a difficult one.
Yeah, well, Kathy and I both deeply, deeply miss our beloved community there at Southern Seminary. And as I said, at our church, LaGrange Baptist Church up in LaGrange in Oldham County. And God had blessed our ministries in so many ways, so richly. When Dr. Greenway was elected by the trustees at Southwestern to be president, he and I had gotten to know each other pretty well. We'd worked together very closely. We were both deans for the same term at Southern. He was dean of the Billy Graham School, I dean of school of theology. And when he asked me to consider going to Southwestern, my initial response was, well, sure, I'll pray about it. I'll go wherever God calls me to go. But I was confident that God was calling me to Southern Seminary. He had called me there, and I was confident that in all likelihood, God was not going to call me anywhere else. I mean, every way I could look at it at that point, it just doesn't make any sense to go anywhere else for any reason. And when I told Kathy that Dr. Greenway had asked us to pray about it and think about it, like Sarah, she laughed, right? And so that's how absurd this whole thing was to us, is that it just seemed impossible that God would call us anywhere else. But out of principle and out of regard for Dr. Greenway, we decided, of course, we will talk about it and pray about it, assuming this would take 24 hours, 48 hours, to be absolutely confident, absolutely sure. But the more we prayed and talked about it, the more we realized that we can't just dismiss it. Mm. And so as we analyzed the situation as best we could from a biblical perspective, it seemed certainly possible that God might call us there. And so we brought in some godly counselors that we started having a discussion in prayer with several godly people and couples, and much to our surprise and much to their surprise, we all came to the same conclusion that as best we can discern, it was our duty to go and lay our shoulder to the work down here. And so we came here because we believe that we were called to come here, and there's nothing else that could have uprooted us from the blessed ministries we had there. Well,
Southern's loss is certainly a gain for Southwestern, and as a Southern Baptist, it's a gain for all Southern Baptists. And so though I'm very sad you're no longer closer to me in proximity, I'm glad that you're serving one of our 6 seminaries, and I'm thankful for what God's doing at Southwestern and how God is using you. And it sounds like you think through these processes similar to the way I do. I think of opportunity, ability, responsibility. And I mean, obviously you had the opportunity, but there's a sense, I think when God's calling us somewhere, where we also have a sense of responsibility, that this is something God's gifted us to be able to do. There's an opportunity here, and then it becomes a responsibility to use our gifts in the best way for the advancement of his kingdom. So I really appreciate the thoughtful, prayerful way you went through that. And I know the Lord has you exactly where he wants you at this time. And I look forward to seeing how God continues to use you. Now, I met you, you probably don't remember this, but it was probably 10 years after you came to Southern. I took a course of yours in 2003, History of the Baptist, and it had a profound impact on me. I think in terms of becoming a historian, probably three things I could point to. One would be my study of baseball history as a kid, and my love for history there, and then interest in Westerns, and then actually wanting to discover the real story behind the kind of mythos of the West as a teenager. And then, so a general love for history, and then coming into that Baptist history course, the first Baptist history course I ever took, it was what we called then J terms, and it was almost exactly 17 years ago to when we're speaking right now, 17 years ago in June, that we had that week-long course. And I was impressed by your piety first, over obviously the historical skill that you have, but as you opened each day, as all of our professors do, but it was just especially devotional time as you opened each class with scripture reading and prayer. That had a tremendous impact on me. I think I mentioned to you before, I think you actually read from the Greek New Testament. You'd think you probably didn't, that wasn't normally your practice, but there may have been something odd going on.
I may have at times. Yeah.
Possible.
It's possible.
Yeah. So, but anyway, I was just deeply struck that you were a person, not just an academic, all knew, but someone who loved Christ and his church. And that had a tremendous impact on me. So thank you for that.
Well, God's grace and mercy is extraordinary. God blessed my ministry at Southern, and I'm just delighted to see the fruit of the Spirit's working in the lives of so many students.
Here's the proof. There it is.
There it is. Look at that.
What about that?
Oh, and still using Torbit.
Using Torbit and democratic religion. I want to talk to you about that in a few moments.
And a reader of primary sources. Boy, I spent many hours putting that together.
I still have that. I've got it here in the drawer close by. And that was one of the gifts of that class, was the exposure that you gave us to primary sources, which was just a tremendous gift. And the paper that you required for that course, I think we might have had two options. One was to do something through the polity book that was several classic Baptist church manuals that Mark Dever had edited and put together in one volume. I think we could go through that, or we could do a research paper. And I had already gone through the polity book at that point, so I wanted to do something different. I did a research paper for you, and that's the first time that I went into a library and kind of did some archival work. You pushed that kind of primary source emphasis, and it was just very, I was skimming the surface of the ground in terms of spade work. But I did go to the microfilm and read some old Baptist papers and found an old confession of faith by the International Mission Board, Foreign Mission Board then, from 1919. And I wrote a paper on confessions of faith in Baptist history. And again, that's something you emphasized in the class, the importance of confessions of faith, church discipline. Those things, I mean, they impact who I am as a pastor and professor and student still to this day. So thank you.
You mentioned that 1919 confession of the International Mission Board, not widely known today. Interesting, 1918, things that are going on leading up to that, of course, but there it is. The 1918 Spanish flu pandemic,
Okay.
of course, is going on at the same time that you're having a very intense discussion among Southern Baptists and among Southern Baptists, between Southern Baptists and some other denominations about cooperation and union. And that's one of the reasons that Southern Baptists at that time doubled down on confessionalism, is because Southern Baptists, the vast majority, said, we will cooperate in ways that we can, but we cannot cooperate in any church or church planning or theological education unless we are agreed on doctrine. And so here's the confessional basis upon which we'll be glad anyone who wants to agree with us will work with you.
Well, that's fascinating. I did not realize that that connection. And is that something you've just been thinking about recently with the pandemic, or is that something you've been aware of for some time?
Well, I have been aware of it in many respects, but you don't always tie together the coherence of things in time, how the participants in history are experiencing things at the same time, because we tend to focus in on a topic or a movement. But it's one of several areas that I've been doing primary research in recent weeks.
Yeah, that's great. Do you think an article might come out of that?
I don't know. I'm trying to finish up a book. I'm sure we'll talk about it later. Yeah. But for example, I was looking at the Southwestern Journal of Theology from the seminary here from 1918, because they had some information on the influenza impact upon the campus from the fall of 1918. But that entire issue otherwise was devoted to this question of union and cooperation, the entire issue. And so it just kind of hit hard, that contemporaneity. They were contemporaries.
Yeah. So lots of things coming together with the rise of modernism and the whole Scopes trial, and a lot of things happening around that period that really pushed Southern Baptists to think about these issues.
Right. And foreign missions was central to that. The fundamentalist modernist controversy for American denominations began on the mission field, began among missionaries in China. American missionaries, and for that matter, United Kingdom missionaries, were fighting it out on liberalism, and a huge controversy emerged among them, and ultimately a very significant division among them at about this time, 1917, 18, 19, and 20. And some of the earliest battles in the United States were echoes and repercussions from what was going on among the missionaries in China. And that includes Southern Baptist missionaries. We had quite a few of our missionaries in China who had embraced liberalism as well. They weren't permitted to stay on. Once we worked it through, they of course were either dismissed or resigned.
You did, one of the things you required in the course that I took with you 17 years ago was the Democratic Religion book. Was that the fruit of your, I think it's the fruit of your doctoral studies. Where did you do that work? And tell us a little bit about the background to that.
Right. I did my PhD at Emory University in Atlanta, a Methodist affiliated school at the divinity school level. Of course, at the university, there's very, very little. There's a traditional connection, of course, to United Methodism, but the divinity school is the only, as far as I know, the only formal connection anymore. But I went there to work with Brooks Holyfield largely, and because of the incredible resources that Emory has, including its library resources. And in the course of doing my preparing for my comprehensive exams and writing a couple of dictionary articles that my supervisor had asked me to write for an encyclopedia that he was one of the editors of, I got into some Southern Baptist primary sources, some biographies, some church minute books, some association minutes, and I discovered there a culture that was entirely different than what I expected to find, because from all kinds of secondary sources, I had expected to see Southern Baptists on the forefront of expressions of individualism and free, free Baptists expressing that in various ways. And what I discovered was very, very different than that. I discovered a movement of evangelical believers who were committed to following Christ as he revealed his will for the churches and for Christians in the scriptures in every area, and that included areas that were very unpopular, areas that, and I should say part of that unpopularity was a rejection of at least certain aspects of individualism. And one of the areas that was most accessible, most visible, was the area of church discipline. And there was a book very popular at that time by Nathan Hatch called The Democratization of American Christianity. Very fine book, and a book that has shaped the research, the scholarship, the writing on American Christianity in many ways over the last 25 years or so. And in that book also, I expected to find Southern Baptists, because of how he portrayed Baptists in that book, Southern Baptists to be these hyper individualists, and nobody can tell any individual what to do. I follow Christ and Christ alone. Nobody can say boo to me. When of course in the churches, it's just the opposite. In order to become a member of a Baptist church, you pledged yourself to a covenant in which you promised to submit to the church and to be subject to its control. And that's the exact phraseology of many of the church covenants of the Southern churches anyway, where I did most of my primary research, especially in Georgia, where I did the bulk of the church level and association level research. So I found a movement very different than what I expected.
Yeah, and I had the cover up for a moment of democratic religion and addressing issues of freedom and authority and church discipline in what were the years 1785 to 1900?
Yes.
So that was a great introduction for me to primary source work, because that's primarily what you're doing, no pun intended, primarily working on those church minute books and
Right.
showing what congregationalism looked like in those churches, and the greatest examples of that in terms of how church discipline was carried out. And one of the questions I'm often asked, and I always use a couple of paragraphs from your book to answer, is why does church discipline not happen as commonly today? Of course, we're seeing a bit of a resurgence of it in our day, but still, I think we have to say predominantly it's not there as much as it was in the 18th, 19th centuries. And I always look, when I first read these words, I may have read your book before the class. I can't remember if I'd already been exposed to it or not, but I always think of these words from your introduction, from page 9. This is your book, page 9. Here's what you said. See if you remember this. This really has stood out to me over the years. And I often, even when I'm doing Zoom conversations with students sometimes, and they ask that question in these live Q&As, I'll reach behind me and pull this book off and I just read it. You said, after the Civil War, Baptist observers began to lament that church discipline was foundering, and it was. It declined partly because it became more burdensome in larger churches. Young Baptists refused in increasing numbers to submit to discipline for dancing, and the churches shrank from excluding them. Urban churches, pressed by the need for large buildings and the desire for refined music and preaching, subordinated church discipline to the task of keeping the church solvent. Many Baptists shared a new vision of the church, replacing the pursuit of purity with a quest for efficiency. That sentence summarizes the last couple hundred years, probably. They lost the resolve to purge their churches of straying members. And then listen to this. Remember this? It's powerful. No one publicly advocated the demise of discipline. No Baptist leader arose to call for an end to congregational censures. No theologians argued that discipline was unsound in principle or practice. No freedom party, in quotes here, arose to quash the tyranny of the redeemed. It simply faded away, as if Baptists had grown weary of holding one another accountable. I can't think of a better description in a couple of paragraphs of what actually happened. And you know, this, do you still affirm that assessment?
Yes. Yes, very much. I think I think that's right.
You know, that's wrote that probably 20 years ago at least, and it is a very helpful, I think, description of what has happened as churches became more interested in growing larger, which is not a bad motivation in and of itself if it means evangelizing, baptizing, discipling believers and holding them accountable. But that's church discipline can get in the way of some of those things that we hold more dear than we do the purity of the church. I think that phrase, purity, a quest for purity to efficiency or pursuit of efficiency, I think that's how you said it.
Yeah.
That's
and I need to say here that whatever insights that book has are 10 times better because my supervisor, Brooks Holyfield, did not let me get away with anything. No sloppiness, no imprecision, no unsourced conclusions or arguments. And so he kept pushing me. He kept kicking my dissertation back with all kinds of, he would use blue and black in two different readings of it, and he would kick it back to me. And so I owe a great debt to him to making me think harder, think deeper, and write more carefully. And so his fingerprints are all over that as well.
You've done that for a generation of students or more now that, I mean, you've had that impact on me in terms of pushing primary sources, make the argument from the sources, don't just generalize. That's been a tremendous gift to me. And I had the opportunity to do a doctoral seminar with you, and it wasn't my best work because I was doing too many at the same. That's my excuse anyway. But that course was very formative in how you had us read through historical works and give a thesis statement. I'm sure you still do this, a thesis statement for each chapter. And to be able to argue that and defend it in class in front of your peers, that was a tremendous gift. And I've got probably behind me here, there may be where you can't see them, the books we read for that course in terms of the works on New England Puritans. Is the course I'm talking about up through the New Divinity. And that was a great, I mean, you continue to pass that on. So I know Brooks Holyfield would be happy with how you're continuing to push people to the sources and to make those cases in a clear way.
Right. And I'm trying to help. The part of my calling, of course, is what that's all about. With regard to counting numbers and popularity, efficiency, all of that, it's a perennial problem with the church. It's been a problem with the church from the very beginning, right? It's one of the ways in which we are tempted to distrust our Creator. All sin, in some measure, in probably fundamental measures, is a distrust of what God has said. Whether it's cognitive or voluntary, wherever the source of it is ultimately a distrust. We don't do what He's commanded. We do something else, which is an expression of distrust, right? And so we don't trust His methods, His truth, His measures and policies, commands in the church to do what the church must do, and that is preach the gospel, save sinners, sanctify the saved, and all to His praise and glory, doing all the things command us to do, and grow. We don't believe that it will actually be successful if we do what God says in the way that God says it. Even if we don't usually mean to be doing that. But if we disobey Him in any of these areas, if we substitute something else, it is a distrust and ultimately a disobedience.
Yeah, that's the irony. These churches were thriving evangelistically, and you show in the book baptizing 50 to 100 people at a time, In fact, there's one striking story you tell, and I can't remember all the details now, that just came to mind, of maybe a young woman named Julia. One of them was Julia, who was calling out to someone who was watching. She was watching her friend being baptized, and it was such a clear break with her former lifestyle that there was a crying out to one another, almost farewell, almost a parting ways. And it was a very moving testimony to all those who were there. And then also another thing came to my mind as you were sharing that, another line you quote, I think it was John Dagg in the book, that when discipline leaves the church, Christ leaves with it.
Yeah, I think he said the Spirit leaves with it. But yes, it's the same thing. And of course, what he's reflecting there is that if we don't exercise church discipline, we are deliberately disobeying.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever rationale we may have, it is still disobedience, no matter how you analyze it. And can a disobedient church, a church that has set its course on disobedience, expect the blessing of the Spirit, the continued presence of the Spirit? Well, no. Now, of course, I've reflected on that phrase many times, actually. And I think I may have even written an essay on it at one point for somebody. But God is so incredibly merciful, right? And so when we take hands to the ark, he doesn't always strike us down the way he did Uzzah.
Mm-hmm.
He would be just in doing so. But God's patience and mercy is often extended over many, many generations. But that does not excuse our disobedience, doesn't excuse our high-handed testing of the Lord. We cannot rely upon his mercy. We must pursue obedience regardless.
You know, we reap those benefits sometimes from previous generations' faithfulness as well. I think you preached a sermon. You mentioned Uzzah and being struck dead as he tried to steady the ark. You preached a sermon several years ago in chapel at Southern. I don't remember how many years ago, but it was on Acts 5, and you addressed the topic of church discipline. And one of the things I think you labored to show there was that Christ takes the purity of his church seriously as was taken the obedience of the Israelites, because those were struck dead. We know those examples from the Old Testament, Abihu, Uzzah, others, but in the New Testament, many.
In fact, I've thought recently that it would be useful to write a little essay or article on all the people whom God killed in the scriptures. Right? Is Lot's wife the first one? I haven't made my list yet, but I've thought about it in my head a few times. That it would probably be very instructive for me to do the exercise, regardless of whether it resulted in an essay or not.
You preached that on and basically talked about the importance of the purity of the church and discipline through that. That was a sermon that made a great impact on me and thinking through these issues. So again, thank you for your work, not only historically accurate, well-sourced, based on your training, but also very applicable to the church today, because there are reasons why these things were done in the past, and we're called to that same faithfulness today. But right. You did. We should move on to talk about another major work you did. By the way, both of these works, Democratic Religion was published by Oxford University Press, just as you've done other works as well, but another major work was the history of Southern Seminary. You probably remember working on that for a number of years, the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary back in 2009. Hard to believe that's been, 11 years ago since that moment, such a big moment for many of us who loved Southern Seminary. And you did the history. And it was a great work. I remember when I read it, and many other people have made this observation, but the real power of it is not only that it told the story of that particular institution, but it's a story that really tells the story of the Southern Baptist Convention during that same time period, which is basically its entire history, as well as evangelicalism, at least in the South. What are your reflections? I mean, thinking back now, 10 years later after having written that, What are your reflections on that and the import of that work that you think still remains? And would you have, is there anything you would have treated differently or handled differently were you writing it today?
Right. All right. So it was, I realized early on in the research that the path of the Southern Baptist Convention strongly paralleled and intersected with the path of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be an excellent means by which to tell the history of Southern Baptist through the history of the seminary. And so that became a goal very early in my research to allow it. And of course, it wasn't just in order to tell the history of Southern Baptist, but because the history of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary could not be told well without fitting it in its context. And so I could, to accomplish the goal of the one, I really had to accomplish the goal of the other in any case. But the thing that became clear so early was that the sources and the story itself, the individuals and the theology and the career of the institution showed how closely intertwined the Southern Baptist experience was with the experience of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. The big benefit is that being a theological seminary, I had a duty as well as an opportunity to deal in depth with the theological controversies and trends impacting the Southern Baptist Convention, because those were being dealt with intensively at the seminary. Now, you asked what would I do differently? Well, I'd love it to be shorter, but I'm not sure that's really possible. What is it, 560 pages or something like that? It may even, I'm not even sure, I don't remember. But I think the one major thing that I would do differently is how I handle slavery and race and white superiority, white supremacy. And no excuses here. My time was short, but I was working really fast. But what I discovered when I wrote the draft of the report of the committee that Dr. Muller appointed 2 years ago to study and produce a report on the legacy of slavery and racism at Southern Seminary, what I discovered was a lot of material that I had not seen. A lot of material that I hadn't seen it because I didn't think to look for it. But here's where I regret. I should have known to look for it. I should have known that I bet if I look for this, I bet I can find things. And so it's not like they were hidden or obscured, but I just wasn't asking the right questions to turn them up. And so having done that, the research for that report, I discovered a lot of material that I regretted not having searched for and found and included in my treatment of the entire history of the seminary. So that's what I would.
Since I knew your role in that report, I thought you might go there with that particular question. One of the great things, and maybe the challenging things about historical studies, is that new questions continue to be being raised and asked, and where that's really beneficial is, as historians, that gives us job security, because there's new ways of coming to look at those primary sources. And when we come asking a different question, we discover things we may miss when we're looking for, you're looking for theological liberalism, you're looking for all those big trends as you go through there, and you did an excellent job with that. And you didn't unfaithfully handle any of the other material either, but just having the perspective and asking that different question turns up other stuff. And it's not like you're recreating. Some people would charge it, this is revisionist history. That's not revisionist history. You're actually discovering stuff that was already there. We just weren't looking in the right places or asking the right questions that uncover that. So thanks for your
human experience is so complex. and the historical record is so complex. There's just no way to capture in a book, in one research effort, writing effort, that complexity. And so asking the new questions, we tell the story from a different angle, different aspects of the story, and that kind of thing. And so we learn more lessons by asking new questions, doing new research.
Well, thank you for your work on that. That's a tremendous piece of the original work, and then the work you did on the report on Southern Seminary and the history of slavery and racism. Both of those are tremendous.
Can I just say, Southern Seminary's history is so important to American evangelicalism and to the history of Southern Baptists. And so I have not changed at all in my appraisal of the importance of that. And so I didn't write that. If I had not thought it was an important story to tell, if I hadn't thought it was really important, I probably wouldn't have taken 4 or 5 years of my life and dedicated it almost exclusively to that.
Mm-hmm.
But I have not changed in my opinion.
Oxford University Press shared that opinion. They don't typically just publish institutional histories, but they recognize, I'm sure the proposal you made articulated the significance of this well beyond any kind of provincial type concern. This is a big deal because of what it says about the wider culture and the denomination. Thank you for your work, and certainly I'm thankful you used that time for that project. So what are you working on now? What are you in terms of writing projects? I know you have the B.H. Carroll Center, which is a tremendous thing. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of that. But and research professor, does that mean you're not doing as much in the classroom? I know it's kind of hard to talk about now with the COVID-19 being a little throwing everything out off kilter. But then what are you writing?
And the center is brand new, and so there's still a lot to be done to get it up and running and doing all the stuff we want it to do. And yeah, COVID-19 has what's the word? Well, it has caused progress to cease on that. But once things get back to normal, or whatever the new normal is, we keep using that phrase, new normal, we'll continue to advance in progress on the research center, the B.H. Carroll Center. What I'm trying to get completed is a draft of a history of Southern Baptists. And so I've got a ton of writing done. I still need to do some more writing, but it's been, the way I wrote it was a little haphazard. I wrote here and then there and didn't write it in chronological order. And so I've got a lot of editorial work to do. So that's the big project on my plate right now. A number of smaller projects, but I also have several books that I want to write. I'd like to write a biography of B.H. Carroll and a couple others perhaps. But in a few years, hopefully write a history of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, if the Lord gives me opportunity to do that.
Great.
And I have it in mind, and I haven't written a proposal yet, but I have it in mind to write or co-write a work on Southern Baptist and slavery and race. That's a big one, but it's really important. Of course, it's really timely. But I've talked to a couple of people about this and would like to do that. I'd love to write a book on baptism, a little book, not a big one, but there's just so much. There's so much from our history, and we Baptists wrote about baptism a lot, of course, for a number of reasons. One of which is because so many other Bible-believing Christians disagreed with us, and so we wrote a lot about it. But it seems to me that a lot of what we once knew as a denomination, we either have forgotten or just barely know. And so I think it would be useful to talk about a lot of these things. One other, what was it I'm going to co-write with Michael Haken, A History of Theology. And so I'm excited about that as well.
Oh, that's great. Well, that should keep you busy for the next few years.
Yeah, I need to pick up the pace.
Well, thank you. The one thing we're certain of that those works will be carefully written. You'll have Brooks Holyfield looking over your shoulder, I'm sure, and you'll continue to document and source your conclusions, and you're a trusted source on matters of history and church history in particular. Thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for your faithfulness as a historian. Thank you. Probably you didn't even realize some of these things I've shared with you today of the impact that you've had on me personally. So thank you for that. I'm sure that can be multiplied thousandfold with students you've had over the years. You've invested, and your sincerity, the reality of your walk with the Lord has been a blessing. Have you been, I'm sure you're plugged into a local church there. I know you love the church, not just generically, but a particular body of believers. And I'm grateful for you and how you model that as a, not just as a historian, but as a churchman. And thank you for that.
Well, brother, thank you for those kind words. It's been a joy getting to know you over the years and share work together in various ways through the seminary. And thank you. It's been a joyful time renewing fellowship here by Zoom.
Well, thank you for the conversation. God bless you, and talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, Steve.